Hello and welcome back to Core Finance with me, Matt Brown, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce onto the show for the first time Stephen Clapham, who is the founder of BehindTheBalanceSheet.com and also writes for various publications including City AM. How are you today, Stephen?
I'm really good, thank you.
Can you just give us, me and our viewers, a little bit of background on BehindTheBalanceSheet.com and who you are and what you do with that?
Yeah, sure, of course. I've been an investment analyst for more years than I care to remember, care to admit to. And my main job actually is a head of research at a small hedge fund. And behind the balance sheet, really kind of a hobby for me, looking at stuff which is maybe a little bit off the mainstream and looking at it with a very independent eye. And I pick subjects I think are interesting and write blogs about them.
Fantastic. And one thing that is quite interesting and that has been current of late in the news and certainly will become more prominent as the year goes on and we move into 2018 is the listing of Saudi Aramco, which is basically the sovereign Saudi oil company looking to list. Now you've done an interesting piece recently about this potential listing and written in the Evening Standard. So just briefly talk us through the listing, the potential for the listing, and what you think about it.
Well, it's been big news, of course, and so the idea that Aramco would be listed was surfaced in The Economist last year. And the interesting thing about Aramco is that they've never published any financial information whatsoever. The only thing that we know about them is how much oil they produce and the reserves. And even the reserves have been very contentious because the reserves have basically flatlined and been constant for the last 25 years. And that's a very unlikely thing to happen because, of course, each year they're producing 3.5 billion barrels of oil. So we don't know very much about it. The reason for doing it is that the new Crown Prince, formerly the Deputy Crown Prince, thinks it's a good idea to privatize Aramco as part of their program to modernize Saudi Arabia and bring it into the 21st century. And they have this program to modernize the whole country by 2030.
So, I mean, that begs the question. They're looking at, I think, initially floating 5% of the company. But by doing that, well, the Saudis have to open their hand on regarding the reserves. And a lot of independent analysis has said, we actually don't believe they have this amount. So is there a risk there for the Saudis by floating, by, as they opening their hand on the reserves?
Well, I don't know how much of it is a risk for them. Because honestly, they will probably find that if their business is managed in the same way as an international oil company, they'll probably find that it is managed in a more efficient or the most efficient way. I'm not saying it's not an inefficient company. The question of the reserves is kind of like a weird one because people don't believe it, but I understand that the reserves have been audited by two firms, by two independent US experts. But there's quite a lot of chat in the oil sector that they don't want to list in New York because the New York listing requirements are much more onerous in terms of disclosure of the reserves, and that's why London is apparently one of the favoured destinations. And the whole question of oil reserves, the supposedly independent commentators, one of them is a subsidiary of Baker Hughes, and Baker Hughes, where's one of its technology centres? Saudi Arabia.
So, I mean, it's very interesting, obviously, if they do float. And the valuation that they put on it, I mean, I've heard numbers being bandied around of $2 trillion, which is a huge number. I mean, that's 10% of the US debt at the moment. So that's a big number. But they're focused in Saudi Arabia. And as an oil play, as an investor, would you want to concentrate so much risk into one region, especially with everything going on in the Middle East and what could happen over the years to come?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the 2 trillion number, I don't know where they've got it from. I don't believe it. Some of the press have been talking about 1.5 trillion as being the new internal estimate, but I mean, you can't understand how they could possibly come up with this number. If you look at Aramco, it produces 3.9-ish, so call it short 4 billion barrels of oil a year, $50 a barrel-ish, that's $200 billion of revenue. You can't get from $200 billion of revenue to 1.5 trillion even with a very low cost of production. I'm sure they've got very low cost of production. We don't know what it is. I've been using, for my estimates, I've been using $10 a barrel. But the point you make is the key one. Yes, they've got other assets, they've got downstream assets, but they can be worth only about 50 billion. And when you're going to invest in an international oil company, the clue's in the name, international. And this is a national oil company, and clearly there are all sorts of risks. There's geographical risks, there's political risks, and they will have to accept a lower valuation. There's no question of that.
And also, for shareholders in the potential company, there's a lot of conflict of interest when you look at OPEC, who potentially want to cut, or they're looking at cutting production to get the oil price up. But it's almost as if they're trying to bid up their own book and bid up the valuation. So at points there could be conflicts of interest in what OPEC or what the Saudi government want to do, what the shareholders want, and where they want the oil price. I mean, everyone wants, obviously, the shareholders and the government want the oil price to be higher. But could you see that becoming a problem or an issue for potential shareholders?
Well, it's a massive issue because Saudi has been the swing producer. So by definition, that means that if the oil price falls, Aramco's production has to fall. And so you get a kind of double whammy. It's a huge problem. And that's the reason why I think that the commentators generally are underestimating how difficult it's going to be to sell this stock.
And as we talk on air today, I mean, about an hour ago, there's been a report saying the FCA may look at reducing the restrictions for listing. Does that feel right for you, to be honest?
Well, this is kind of a difficult situation, isn't it? Because you can ask yourself, well, should you relax rules? And, you know, the definition has to be, well, these are rules and they have to be observed by international companies. But, you know, one of the main rules that is the limit that they impose, the number of shares or the percentage of the company that has to be floated in order for it to be included in an index. And clearly, the easiest way for the Saudis to sell this is to get it in an index.
Yes.
And it sounds like they could put quite a lot of pressure on LSE, and obviously London wants Saudi to float Aramco here. But there's also political pressure. I mean, we do a huge amount of business with the Saudis. So I think the institutional market is very much against the idea of relaxing the rules. Royal London, their corporate governance expert, has been on record as saying, under no circumstances should we relax the rules to allow this. I believe that in a way it doesn't matter because they could construct a vehicle which allowed them to get in the index, a vehicle which owned the 5% or whatever of the shares, and it would go in the index. So I think there are probably rules around it. I think there's arguments for and against, but at the end of the day, it's a commercial versus a regulatory requirement, and you know, regulators should be independent, and if they show themselves not to be independent, there's going to be some questions, I guess.
And it's going to be hard for these institutions who probably don't, for moral reasons, don't want to own the company, but if it is in an index and they have an index tracker, they're going to have to own the stock.
Well, the index trackers will have to, and that's that's the easy way to sell it. But of course, somebody has to set the price, and the index tracker can't, by definition, set the price. So I think we could have quite an odd arrangement where the price is actually set by some Chinese sovereign buyers, so some Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, where they are actually setting the price of the issue. It goes in the index, and index trackers here are forced to buy it. Might be an easy way for other people who aren't tracking an index, for active managers to perform by not owning it.
Very interesting. Well, we look forward to the start of 2018 and how this will pan out. But in the meantime, Stephen Clapham, thank you so much for joining us on Core Finance today.
Thank you for having me.